about the desegregation of schools in the mid-1950s, most people refer to the Brown versus Board of Education case in the Supreme Court. What most people do not know, however, is that there was a case right here in Washington, D.C. that helped lead to a turning point in our nation's capital. D.C. public schools have played an important role in the development of Brown versus Board of Education. Henry Edgerton wrote that school segregation is humiliating to Negroes. It brands the Negro with the mark of inferiority and asserts that he is not fit to associate with white people. Blacks and whites were comfortable in being separated, but segregation was harmful for the education of African Americans. Desegregation of D.C. schools was a turning point for our community because the former two separate communities, black and white, started to interact with each other. Although D.C. is still changing, the Brown versus Board case, Bonley versus Sharp, was the starting point of this change in interaction. With the help with some former teachers and students, research on the court case, and lawyers that impacted the Brown case, and a look at D.C. schools today, I will note how this one decision, tied to a case involving our schools, changed our city, our community, and our culture. Before 1954, Washington, D.C. was a fully segregated city. In the shadow of the Capitol were all African American neighborhoods. In other pockets of the city were all white neighborhoods. Not only were the neighborhoods segregated, the schools were completely separated by race.
It had a small town feel because most black people lived in one area and white people lived in another area, and rarely did the twain meet. U Street was sort of the mecca for black people's social activities with nightclubs and restaurants, and all the schools were more or less together, so most people knew one another in 1954 because the professional people often lived near poorer people, so there was interaction, and in that way you could see a doctor and say, I want to be a doctor, because you could see how they lived and you would admire it. And that's the way it was. And it was comfortable.
How did it make you feel to live in a segregated society?
Oddly enough, Carson, I felt okay with it. Simply because since there was no interaction, we never visited Wilson. The students from Wilson never came to Minor. We didn't know that there were any differences in the way that we were taught or anything. We were happy at Minor. And I'm sure they were happy at Wilson.
We shall not be moved.
Beginning in late 1949, a group of parents from the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C., calling themselves the Consolidated Parents Group, petitioned the Board of Education of the District of Columbia to open the nearly completed John Philip Sousa Junior High as an integrated school. The school board denied the petition and the school opened, admitting only whites. On September 11, 1950, Gardner Bishop, Nicholas Sable, and the Consolidated Parents Group attempted to get 11 African American students, including the case plaintiff Spotswood Bowling, for whom the case was named, admitted to the school, but were refused entry by the school's principal. The defendant in this case was Melvin Sharp, the president of the Board of Education of District of Columbia. James LeBrit, a law professor from Howard University, represented Spotswood and the other students who wanted to attend Sula Junior High. He took the case to the District Court of the District of Columbia. LeBrit did not try to argue that the black schools were inferior to the white schools. Instead, he gave the district government the task of showing a reasonable basis for school segregation. The case was originally argued on December 10 through 11, 1952, but was rejected by the DC Court. The Supreme Court decided to review Bowling v. Sharp on December 8th and 9th of 1953. Bowling's case went before the Supreme Court, and the court ruled in this favor in Bowling v. Sharp, decided at the same time as the Brown v. Board of Education case in 1954. On May 17, 1954, on the day of Brown's decision was decided, the Supreme Court agreed that segregation was unconstitutional. Washington, D.C.'s Board of Education moved quickly to desegregate. Only 8 days after the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, read the Supreme Court's Brown decision, the board adopted a desegregation plan. On September 13, 1954, less than 4 months after Bowling v. Sharp, schools across the city opened with integrated faculties and students. After a few months with integrated schools, teachers, students, and administrators began to realize that the schools gained some serious problems as a direct result of integration. White students led strikes at 2 area high schools, complaining that some black students used vulgar language and bumped against white girls in the halls, touching them in a suggestive manner. Many teachers noted a rise in fighting and petty theft, and some white teachers reported problems disciplining black students. After years of attending inferior schools, black students were behind their white peers academically. An undercurrent of racial tension ran throughout the schools. After desegregation, very few black students and teachers were in white schools. To encourage desegregation, black teachers were sent to all white schools. Most schools were still segregated by race until the late 60s when the school boundaries changed. So where are we now, 58 years after Bowling and Sharp and the Brown v. Board of Education cases here in Washington, D.C.? The city is much more integrated today. Or is it? There are still pockets of single-race neighborhoods and single-race schools throughout the city. Even in integrated schools, students tend to self-segregate themselves into pockets. In my own school cafeteria, while there are some examples of multiracial friend groups, you find that most people are still sticking to their own groups. A visit to Sousa Junior High School finds a nearly 100% black student body. The same goes for Eastern High School, Dunbar High, and formerly all-white schools like Roosevelt High and Coolidge. There are still ways to go. Desegregation of DC schools was a turning point for our community because the former 2 separate communities, black and white, started to interact with each other. While there are still pockets of self-segregation, the Bowling v. Sharp case started the turning of the corner in the city from a southern segregated town to a dynamic city with opportunities for everyone. My school is an excellent example of that. Yes, this was a turning point, beginning of a long term that we are still doing. If only Spotswood Bowling can see now the result of their case being brought to the courts. I am proud of the work that these people did to get us here today. Now it is my generation's turn to take advantage of it and work towards a more just and fair society for everyone.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have